I never thought our sunny vacation in Florida would leave me with nightmares that still wake me up in the middle of the night. It was supposed to be a getaway, a chance to unwind with my wife, Emma, and our 2 kids, Lucy and Ethan. But what happened during that week is something I can barely bring myself to talk about. We arrived in Florida on a blistering July afternoon. The air was thick and sticky, carrying the scent of the ocean and sunscreen. Our rental house was tucked away in a quiet, palm-lined neighborhood not far from the beach. It looked perfect in the photos, cozy, bright, and just isolated enough to feel like we had our own slice of paradise. The first 2 days were everything we hoped for. We splashed in the waves, built sandcastles, and indulged in fresh seafood. Lucy, who's 10, couldn't get enough of the tide pools, while Ethan, just 6, spent hours chasing seagulls and collecting shells. At night, we'd sit on the patio, listening to the cicadas hum under the glow of string lights. It was on the 3rd day that things took a dark turn. We had planned a quiet evening at home after a long day at the beach. Emma had just finished grilling some burgers, and we were settling in for a family movie night when we heard it, a faint knocking sound. It was so soft at first I thought I imagined it. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, pausing with a plate in her hand. "Probably just the wind," I replied, though I felt a strange unease creep over me. But then it came again, louder this time. A steady knock 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 on the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. The kids froze. Ethan clutched his stuffed shark, his wide eyes darting between me and the door. I walked over, my heart pounding in my chest. The backyard was dark, the porch light casting only a weak glow across the deck. But there was no one there. "Probably a raccoon or something," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Emma didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. We locked the doors and went on with our evening, though the tension in the room was palpable. That night, I woke up to the sound of Lucy screaming. I bolted out of bed, Emma right behind me. Lucy's room was at the end of the hall, and as I threw open her door, my stomach dropped. She was sitting upright in bed, tears streaming down her face. "There was a man," she sobbed, pointing toward her window. "He was looking at me." I rushed to the window and threw back the curtain, but there was nothing outside except the empty backyard. Still, I could feel eyes on me, a prickling sensation that raised the hairs on my neck. I spent the rest of the night sitting by Lucy's bed, listening to every creak and rustle the house made. I told myself it was just her imagination, a bad dream brought on by too much excitement. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, we found footprints in the sand just outside her window, bare footprints pressed deep into the ground. The police came and took a report, but there wasn't much they could do. They said it was probably some local kid playing a prank, but their words didn't ease my growing fear. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the sky in streaks of orange and pink, we decided to stick close to home. I kept the kids inside while Emma and I double-checked every door and window. At around 10 p.m., we heard it again, the knocking. This time it was louder, more insistent. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left by the door and swung it open, ready to confront whoever or whatever was out there. The beam of light swept across the yard, and for a moment, everything seemed still. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow slipping into the line of trees at the edge of the property. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer. That night, none of us slept. The next day, we decided to leave early. Whatever was happening wasn't worth risking our safety. But as we packed up the car, Ethan came running out of the house, clutching a piece of paper in his tiny hand. "Daddy, this was under my bed," he said, his voice trembling. I unfolded the paper and felt the blood drain from my face. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "You can't leave. I'm already inside." I don't remember much about the drive to the nearest hotel. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. When we got there, I called the police again, but by the time they searched the house, whoever or whatever had been there was gone. To this day, I don't know who left that note or how they got in. But one thing's for sure, I'll never look at a quiet Florida vacation the same way again. When my dad called us into the living room that Saturday morning, his face lit up with excitement. I should have known something was off. Dad wasn't the kind of guy to enter contests, let alone win them. But there he was, holding the phone in one hand and the radio in the other, grinning like a kid at Christmas. "Guess what, guys? I just won us a trip to Africa," he exclaimed. My mom's eyebrows shot up. My little brother David cheered. And I just sat there blinking, unsure of how to process the news. A free vacation? To Africa? Sounded too good to be true, but Dad was adamant. He had answered a trivia question on a local radio station and somehow snagged an all-expenses-paid trip for the entire family. Flights, accommodations, guided tours, everything was covered. 2 weeks later, we were on a plane, hurtling toward what I'd imagined would be the adventure of a lifetime. The journey was long, but the excitement kept us buzzing. When we landed in Nairobi, we were greeted by our tour guide, Daniel, a friendly man with a warm smile and an accent that made every word he spoke sound poetic. He loaded us into a sturdy jeep and drove us to our lodge, nestled deep in the Masai Mara. The lodge was stunning, with thatched roofs and open-air dining areas overlooking a vast expanse of savanna. Felt surreal, like stepping into a postcard. We spent our first few days exploring the area, spotting elephants, giraffes, and even a pride of lions during our game drives. It was magical, but then things started to change. On the fourth night, a storm rolled in. The sky turned an ominous shade of gray, and the wind howled like a living thing. Rain lashed against the windows of our cabin, and the once cozy lodge felt eerily isolated. That night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, a distant, rhythmic pounding, like drums. I sat up in bed, straining to hear over the storm. David was fast asleep in the bed next to mine, and my parents' room was silent. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped out of bed, careful not to wake anyone. The hallway outside was dark, the power having gone out earlier in the evening. I crept toward the main lodge, the sound of the drums growing louder with each step. When I reached the front door, I hesitated. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the air outside was heavy with the scent of wet earth. The drumming was louder now, accompanied by low, guttural chanting that sent chills down my spine. I stepped outside, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. The sound was coming from the far side of the lodge, near the edge of the forest. Against my better judgment, I followed it. My bare feet sank into the muddy ground as I approached a clearing lit by a flickering fire. What I saw there froze me in my tracks. A group of people, their faces obscured by intricate masks, danced around the fire. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, as if they were being controlled by invisible strings. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, and I realized with a jolt that the figures weren't alone. Something was moving in the shadows beyond the firelight, something huge and sinuous, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. I couldn't make out its shape, but the air around it seemed to shimmer, as if reality itself was bending to accommodate its presence. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and plunging me into darkness. The chanting stopped abruptly, and in the silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing. I turned to run but collided with something solid. A hand clamped over my mouth, stifling my scream. "Shoo!" a voice whispered. It was Daniel. His face was pale, his usual calm demeanor replaced by sheer panic. "You shouldn't be here." He dragged me back toward the lodge, his grip like iron. When we were safely inside, he locked the door and turned to me, his expression grim. "What you saw out there, forget it," he said. "Some things are better left alone." I tried to protest, to ask questions, but he silenced me with a look. "Go back to your room. Stay inside. Do not leave, no matter what you hear." I obeyed, shaken to my core. That night, the sounds of the drums and chanting haunted my dreams. The next morning, the lodge staff acted as if nothing had happened. Daniel avoided me, his usual warmth replaced by a cold detachment. My parents and David were oblivious, chatting excitedly about the day's planned activities. I wanted to tell them what I'd seen, but something held me back. Fear, perhaps, or the nagging sense that they wouldn't believe me. The rest of the trip passed in a haze. I stayed close to my family, avoiding the forest and the lodge's staff as much as possible. When we finally boarded the plane home, I felt a wave of relief. But the sense of unease lingered, a shadow that refused to lift. Months later, I found an article online about the Masai Mara. It mentioned local legends, stories of ancient spirits that roamed the land, demanding respect and appeasement. As I read, the memory of that night came flooding back, more vivid than ever. I still don't know what I saw in the clearing or what the masked figures were doing. But one thing is certain. Our free vacation came with a price, one that continues to haunt me to this day. My name is Lily, and this is a story I've kept to myself for a long time. I don't like to think about it much because every time I do, I feel that same creeping dread that consumed me during those terrifying days. But maybe sharing it will help me make sense of it, or at least make sure others know to be careful even in the most innocent-seeming situations. It happened 2 winters ago. My family and I decided to take a vacation to a ski resort in Colorado. It was one of those picturesque places you see in travel magazines, nestled in the mountains with snow-covered cabins and cozy fireplaces. I was 17 at the time, and honestly, I wasn't thrilled about spending a week away from my friends. But my parents insisted it would be good for us to have some family time. The first couple of days were uneventful. I'm not a great skier, but I managed to make it down the beginner slopes without embarrassing myself too much. My little brother, Jake, spent most of his time building snow forts, and my parents were happy sipping hot chocolate by the lodge's massive stone fireplace. I thought it was going to be a dull, predictable week. That changed on the 3rd day. I had just finished a solo run down one of the easier trails when I met him. His name was Alex, or at least that's what he told me. He looked about my age, with messy dark hair and a confident grin that seemed to dare me to figure him out. He was leaning against a snowboard near the base of the slope, and when our eyes met, he smiled and said something about how I nailed that run. I don't usually talk to strangers, but there was something about Alex that put me at ease. He was charming in a casual, effortless way, and before I knew it, we were sitting in the lodge, talking over cups of hot chocolate. He told me he was there with his uncle but didn't go into much detail about his family. He asked a lot of questions about me, where I was from, what I liked to do, that sort of thing. At the time, it felt flattering. Looking back, it feels like he was studying me. Over the next few days, we spent more time together. We'd meet up after breakfast and hit the slopes, sometimes racing each other or just goofing around. My parents were fine with it. They figured it was nice that I'd made a friend. And Alex seemed normal. Nice. He'd joke about how bad I was at snowboarding, which was true, and I'd tease him about his ridiculous sunglasses. It was easy to forget that I barely knew him, but little things started to bother me. For one, I never saw Alex with his uncle or anyone else. Whenever I asked about his family, he'd change the subject or give vague answers. And then there were the times I'd catch him watching me. Not in a cute, flirty way. It was more intense, like he was trying to figure out what I was thinking. The turning point came on our last night at the resort. Alex and I had planned to go night skiing, which I'd never done before. My parents were fine with it as long as I stayed on the well-lit trails. Alex met me at the lodge, his snowboard tucked under one arm. He seemed more energetic than usual, almost jittery, but I didn't think much of it. We took the lift up to one of the trails and started our run. The slope was quiet and empty. The only sounds the crunch of snow under our boards and the occasional gust of wind. About halfway down, Alex suggested we take a detour. He pointed to a narrow trail that branched off into the trees. "It's a shortcut," he said. "Trust me, it'll be fun." Something about the way he said it made me hesitate. The trail looked darker than the main slope, the trees thick and menacing in the moonlight. But I didn't want to seem scared, so I nodded and followed him. The farther we went, the more uneasy I felt. The trail was steep and winding, with sharp turns that made it hard to keep up with Alex. He was always just ahead, moving faster than seemed safe. At one point I called out to him, asking if we were almost there. He didn't answer. Then, without warning, he stopped. I barely managed to avoid crashing into him. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Do you trust me?" he asked. I froze. The question seemed strange, out of place. Before I could answer, he stepped closer, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. His grin, the one I'd found so charming, looked different now. It was wider, too wide, and there was something cold and predatory in his eyes. "We should head back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why?" he asked, his tone light but mocking. "We're just getting started." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I turned my board and started down the trail as fast as I could. The trees blurred past me, and my heart pounded in my chest. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him behind me, his snowboard carving through the snow. He was gaining on me. The trail ended abruptly, opening onto a frozen lake. I barely managed to stop before sliding onto the ice. Alex was right behind me, his board skidding to a halt. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us deafening. Then he spoke. "You're not very good at following directions, are you?" I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, considering me. "I've had fun this week," he said, "but all good things have to end." Before I could respond, he lunged at me. I scrambled backward, slipping on the ice, and somehow managed to get to my feet. I grabbed a loose branch lying near the edge of the lake and swung it at him, catching him off guard. He stumbled, and I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to the lodge. My legs felt like jelly, and my lungs burned from the cold air. When I finally burst through the doors, I found my parents and told them everything. The resort staff searched the area but didn't find anyone matching Alex's description. There was no record of him staying there, and no one else had seen him all week. To this day, I don't know who Alex was or what he wanted. But I do know one thing. I'll never ignore my instincts again.